Welcome. What we will do in this demonstration is to see how to create a rocky ridge. So essentially, in the last few demonstrations, we have seen how to create, stones and then, rocks and even mountains by using, this same technique where we create these successive layers, something like this. So we start with the base layer, and then we add the successive layers, and then essentially, we texture them to create, this kind of roundness and series of, rounded planes to essentially create a field for a mountain or a rock or a pile of stones. So what we will do is use this something similar, a similar technique to essentially create a field for a kind of a ridge that is comprised of stones, in a sense, a kind of rocky ridge. So the technique is very similar. So what I did was to just create an outline of such a ridge, and what I will do next is to essentially again start by laying down these layers. This is similar to what we did initially before for our stones and mountains, but what I'm doing this time is to go from top down. So essentially for the mountains and the rock, we did from bottom up, and what I'm doing for a kind of ridge is to essentially go top down, and what I will also do is to use a bit more angular kind of strokes. So essentially, we saw how to use these kind of bit more curvy, bit more lines, plain lines like this for the mountains and rocks. But for the rocky region, I want to bring out a bit more feel for the kind of a bit of jagged stone. So what I will do is to essentially use a bit more curvy lines, something like this. And the other thing I will do is to also increase the size of this successive stones or successive layers as we go down. So essentially we'll have the biggest stones on the ground over here, and then we'll have a feeling of decreasing size as we go up the ridge. So that's what we will do. So as you can see, the concept is very similar, which is to essentially use the successive layers and lay down your successive layers, and then what we will do is to essentially texture them using the parallel line that we have seen before. And now also I'm trying to use different shapes and different kind of sizes. So over here you can see that this goes a bit bit down, and then I'm also avoiding any kind of uniformity. So I'm not doing something very similar. So I'm trying to avoid a uniformity in my layout of these kind of stones or small rocks that comprise this ridge. So there we have it. So it's essentially as you can see, the concept is very similar. It's just that you have to be careful in terms of giving it the right feeling. So essentially over here, if you want to essentially have a feel for a kind of rocky ridge within that's comprised of stones and things like that, then we need to use a bit of just sharp edges to bring out that feeling over there. And always remember to vary the size with the distance, because that gives you the right sense of perspective, right? So I'm using the smallest sizes at the top, but as I go down, so for example here I can add a bit more, even make it a bit more smaller, and as we go down, I'm adding a bit more of these stones, bigger size layers. So my layers, they're increasing in size as we go down. So there we have it. So something like this over here, and there we have it. So this is giving a nice feel for a distant a kind of rocky ridge that has these stones on its face over here, something like this. And I'll go ahead and again over here I will create a very small layer, and at this point, if you want, you can even create a second ridge that is coming out from there, something like this, right? So I won't go into detail, but the concept is very similar, right? So over here something like this and something like this. So if you want, you can always come back and add another layer in between the layers as well. So if I feel that this is too big, then I can just simply come back. So this is always good to adjust this different size shapes of this layer, so that you get a nice feel from them. So there we have it. So I just added a few more layers just to kind of give it a nice distribution, a nice sense of orientation there, and something like that. So this is how easily, again, the concept is very similar again. So I'm going and just laying down these layers and to create a nice feel for a kind of a ridge that extends from here and goes a shape like this, and this has these kind of stones on its face. So there we have it. So again, the thing is, these compositions are very versatile. They're very fun to do, because anytime you start and you lay down these layers, you will be doing it differently. So it will be a new fun drawing every time. So there we have it. So I'll just lay it down a bit. So once we have this, this layer, the next step is to essentially texture them, and we use the same parallel lines that we have seen before to texture them. So essentially, what we need to do is to bring out their form. So I will use this one layer of parallel lines, and then I'll go back and add, another layer to create a bit of tonal difference later on. So I'll just start by laying down my one layer over here. So this is again, similar to what we did for the stones and the rock and mountains based on the same technique. So essentially, this technique is very powerful. This is a very simple technique where you lay down the successive layers, and essentially use these layers to either create a different stones, or use these layers to essentially comprise of the same unit of a rock, and these layers then become different ridges on that rock, or they become different ridges on a mountain. So over here what we are doing is to create a feeling of these ridges on the surface of this ridge to create a kind of feel for a rocky ridge. So there we have it. So essentially again just go back and texture them something like this. And again, do not avoid the tendency to have one big line across the face. What you need to texture each layer separately, because that is how you will get the feeling of each layer as being separate. So essentially I do not want to just lay down one big layer, one big line that goes across different layers. So you have to be careful to just essentially add these parallel lines to each layer. So this is how your each layer will have its own independent form, and that is how you will get a feeling of this ridge comprised of these independent layers. And when you're doing these small levels, be careful over here just to add a small line over here, something like this over here. So I'll go ahead and add a bit more line over here. So as you can see, as you add these lines, this is already starting to acquire a feel of these different layers comprising this ridge. So this is how easily you can just add those successive layers and use these parallel lines to texture them to bring out their form a bit. But again, the thing is, you can see that this is not giving a good definition, a good contrast. So what we will do is to come back and add one more layer of parallel lines to create a bit more darks, to create a more feeling for the volume of these layers. So let me just quickly add a bit more over here. So again, you have to be very good in putting these parallel lines down, something like this, so that you get a uniform tone. And that's something that I've suggested you practice extensively before. So for pen and ink, the way you lay down a tone is through this use of parallel lines, and the way you vary a tone is by adding more lines, essentially to create that kind of tonal difference. So this is what you have to practice extensively. And once you're able to put down these tones, then you need to know the technique that is involved in creating different elements. And that's what I've covered in my tutorials. Is I focus on a particular element, and then I describe the core technique that is involved and the approach to using the technique and texturing it. So over here, what we are looking at is how you can use the same technique of laying down these layers, but coming top down to create a kind of feel for a rocky ridge. And the texturing that we do over here is again using these parallel lines, and in the end we will also add a bit of crevices and things like that, just to give it a bit more feel for the imperfection of the surface. But essentially, so there we have it. So this is how you can easily add these kind of parallel lines, and there we have it. So now we have a nice feel for a kind of ridge going down. And what we will do next is to simply come back and add a bit more to the base of these ridges. So essentially, what we do simply is to add a bit more dark to the base of these ridges to bring out their form even more. This is something we did when we were doing the mountain and the rocks using these rounded form. So this is, and as you can see, once you add a bit of dark black to the base of the ridge, it brings out the form of this ridges more, and it brings out the roundness more, because you need to have some kind of tonal difference, tonal separation between the different layers on one of these ridges, so that gives a feeling of roundness. So essentially we start by laying down one layer of parallel lines, and then we add one more layer over here. As you can see, this is dark, this is light, so that kind of tonal difference brings out the roundness of these layers nicely. And that's what we want. Essentially what we want is to get a feel for the roundness, this curvature of these successive layers. So essentially these layers, they're acting as a kind of indication of rockiness, or kind of surface imperfection and things like that, that is giving this ridge a feel for it, right? So we need to add these kind of darks at the base of these layers to essentially bring out that feeling. So that's what I'm doing. So essentially I'm going back, and so this is very similar to what we saw when we learned how to create rounded stones, right? So you essentially need to have that kind of tonal separation, but I'm not creating 2 or 3 layers of tones as we saw for stones, but simply 2 layers. So essentially what I'm doing is to have one layer of parallel line, and then going back and just adding a bit of dark to the base of these ridges. So there we have it, something like this. So as you can see, adding this dark, brings out a bit more of the volume of these ridges. So there we have it. So as you can see now, we are getting a bit more feel for the volume of this ridges. So I'll just go ahead and add a bit more. And what happens is when you reach these, ridges that are very small, just, add a bit of dark at the base, something like this, something like this. Just adding a bit of dark to the base, really brings out their volume as well. And that, that volume of the small ridges also, contributes to getting a nice feel for this ridge. So that's what I will do. Is for the small ridges, I'll just move my pen a bit just to add a bit of dark to their base, something like this, something like this. So as you can see, compared to, if you compare this side with this side, you can have a lot more feel for the volume over here, because you have added, that dark to provide that contrast. So this is always important to have that contrast over here, uh, so that, it brings out their volume and it brings out that feel that you want in your ridge. There we have it. So I simply added a bit of darks, and there we have it. So now this side is looking like a nice, kind of ridged feeling. And what I will do is I'll go back and, add the same bit of, darkness to the bottom of the other ridges as well. So over here, something like this. So just, add a bit more. And again, you don't overdo it. Again, we do not really want to make it too dark. So essentially what I do is simply add a bit of second layer at the base, just to, over here. So we have dark and we have light. So that brings out the roundness nicely. So there we have it. So this is how, you can easily create a ridge. And this, again, this is very fun to do, because essentially, anytime you want to have some very simple drawing, and you want to do it from your imagination, these compositions in that involve a ridge like this, or kind of, a mountain with a rounded form that we saw before, or a small collection of stones. These are very fun to do, because you can easily draw them from your imagination. You can just simply start putting down in different layers, and then there you have it. So essentially this is how quickly you just put down the layers and you texture them, and then you have a nice ridge. And what you can do after that is to essentially add a lot of other elements. So I won't be covering that over here, but essentially at this point, you can have some trees over here, or you can have a distant foliage, or even a mountain in the backdrop. So there are a lot of other possibilities. There are almost and a lot of other elements that you can use along with this ridge as its backdrop, right, to add more interest to your composition. Or even such a ridge like this, in isolation is very fun to do. You can simply have one single house over here, or anything like that, right? So there's a lot of options, a lot of possibilities with a ridge like this. But what I really wanted to show is how how simple it is to create a ridge like this by using the same notion of successive layers, and by doing the same shading using the parallel lines that we have seen for stones and for some other elements like like rocks and even mountains. So there we have it. So something very similar, right? So now you can see that this is having a nice feel for a kind of a rocky ridge. And at this point, if you want, you can put some grass at the base, or you can do a lot of other additions to this landscape. So I'll just go ahead and add a bit more over here, add a bit more over here, something like this. So there we have it, a nice simple ridge that we drew. And at this point, we can add a bit of grass, or what I will do instead is to just create a bit of trees over here, something like this in the distance. So that will become a secondary focal point, something like this. And then you simply use these parallel lines to create their foliage. So again, we have seen this in detail in other demonstration, how you can use these parallel lines to create a simple tree with their foliage. So there we have it, something like this. And then again, I will add a bit more over here, something like so. This is how easy it is, so simply use this parallel lines to draw a tree, something like this, and there we have it. And we can also put down some tree over here. So this is a bit more in the distance, so I will just put a very small tree over here. So you always have to keep that in mind, is that if your landscape has perspective in a sense of different distances, then you need to draw different elements in proportion. So I have my trees much smaller over here, and these trees are a bit closer, so they're a bit bigger. So there we have it, something like this. And at this point, yeah, I can cover this with some kind of grass or something like that. So let me do that as well. Or actually I'll just leave it like this, because I've covered grass in a lot of other demonstrations. So I'll just simply leave it like this. But yeah, so this is how you can easily create a kind of nice rocky ridge, and then you can add a lot of other elements. And at this point, if you want, you can also add a bit of crevices and dots and something like this, just to create a bit of surface imperfection over here as well. So what I will do is to just create a bit of surface jaggedness over here, and just add a bit of dots. So again, what we're doing is adding these kind of crevices, tapered crevices, just to bring out a bit more for feeling for the imperfections on the surface, something like this. But yeah, you don't, again, it depends on your interest. If you want to add a bit more and give it a bit more feel for the roughness, then you can do that. Or else you can just leave it like this. So this is how easily you can create a nice kind of a rocky ridge, and yeah, add other elements, have a nice simple landscape around it. Thanks, take care, bye bye.